Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are across the globe. You are very welcome to this side evening event of CSocD59 concerning economy of well-being, a holistic approach to achieve the Agenda 2030 goals. It's indeed a great honor and pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Finnish government to this webinar. I would also like to thank the African Union Commission for the co-sponsorship of this event. Since the World Summit for Social Development in Copenhagen in 1995, the UN Commission for Social Development has promoted systematically the goals of the Copenhagen Summit, later enriched by the SDGs. The mission has been to advance social progress, better quality of life and well-being for all within the ecological boundaries of our globe. It is widely recognized that social development towards inclusive societies for all cannot be achieved by the social sectors alone, nor through piecemeal initiatives. The economy of well-being approach aims at building a bridge between economic and social development policies. Economy of well-being is a holistic approach that puts people at the center of sustainable development agenda as beneficiaries and as agents of action. As opening remarks for our webinar, I am delighted to share the video message from Ms. Jutta Urpilainen, who is the EU Commissioner for International Partnerships. Before joining the Commission, Ms. Urpilainen served as a member of the Finnish Parliament for over 15 years. From 2011 to 2014, she served as Finland's Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister. Currently, in her role as a Commissioner, Ms. Urpilainen oversees the European Commission's work on international cooperation and sustainable development. Ms. Urpilainen.
Dear friends, when Nelson Mandela retired from public life, he declared that as long as poverty, injustice and gross inequality persist in our world, none of us can truly rest. These words are still valid. The most vulnerable have been the first to suffer. The low-paid, informal and unprotected workers, including migrants. Women and girls face now more gender-based violence and lower educational prospects. The best way to correct this is through strong partnerships. Team Europe brought EU and member states together. We have helped our partners to manage the impact of the pandemic. And we continue to use Team Europe in our external action toolbox. This includes equality flagship initiatives in partner countries. We strive for evidence-based policies for a global recovery that is fair, inclusive and green. We have also collective responsibility to avoid the generational catastrophe in education, to quote United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Equal access to quality education is the foundation of sustainable, equitable and resilient societies. Dear friends, SDG 10, dedicated to reducing inequalities, unites us all with a single vision and a clear target. Coming back to the words of Mandela, there is no time to rest in the pursuit of equality.
Thank you. As Commissioner Urpilainen reminded us, we all must continue to work towards including social goals and values social and gender equality in all policies. It's now my great honor to introduce our three distinguished panelists who will share their perspectives and good practices on our theme. First, may I introduce our panelist, Dr. Sania Nishtar. She is Special Assistant of Pakistan's Prime Minister and Federal Minister, Poverty Alleviation and Social Safety Ministry. Dr. Nishtar is the founder of Ihsas, the government's flagship social protection program, and leads its implementation. She also chairs the Benazir Income Support Program and the government of Pakistan's Council on Poverty Alleviation. Welcome, Dr. Nishtar. It's our honor to have you with us today. Second, we have Mr. Lefoko Kesamang from the Department of Social Affairs, African Union Commission. He is responsible for the African Union's disability, aging programs, social protection, and social policy, as well as for the policy development and facilitation of the implementation of the policies and legal instruments of the African Union. Welcome, Mr. Kesamang. We are very happy to have you with us today. And our third panelist, we are pleased to introduce Ms. Amanda Zanou, who is the Knowledge and Policy Lead for the Wellbeing Economic Alliance, We All. She's an economic policy expert with over a decade of experience working with governments and international development institutions around the world. We are delighted to have you with us, Ms. Zanou. Just before starting, I would like to encourage our participants online to take part in the discussions in the chat box and on social media with the hashtags Economy of Wellbeing, CSocD59, and Everyone Included. And now we are eager to start the panel discussion. The theme of this year's CSocD is just transition towards more sustainable and inclusive social development. I would like to hear your views, how you would see economy of well-being like approaches to promote this theme we have selected for CSocD this year. May I ask Dr. Nishtar to start? The floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's an honor indeed, and I would like to thank your government for taking the leadership to organize this very important conversation. Your question about the theme and its relevance to today is extremely important. COVID-19 has put so many challenges on the table, and I think that the foremost challenge is related to the well-being and the welfare of people. Poverty, well-being, the lack of poverty, inclusive sustainable development as such, welfare, these are all interconnected concepts. And it's basically about improving the lives of people. It's basically about lifting people, families out of poverty, giving them opportunity. So the theme that you have put on the table is highly relevant. And this is a very challenging time for the world. It's a challenging time for developing countries because, especially from the anti-poverty and the inclusive sustainable development lens, because during the era of the Millennium Development Goals, the MDG on poverty was achieved 10 years ahead of schedule. But now with the SDG, the relevant SDG on poverty, we are sliding backwards, and we are sliding backwards very fast. I mean, estimates now tell us that upwards of 100 million people will fall into poverty as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. And we are all aware and witness to the livelihood difficulties that were created by hundreds of millions of individuals as a result of the impact of COVID-19. And these livelihood difficulties were not just for people in the developing world. It was also equally, the situation was also equally dire for the developed countries. So this has had a very regressive worldwide footprint. So the need, so this is a long-winded way of saying that the subject of your discussion for the discourse today is a highly relevant subject. This is a time for us to rethink what welfare means. This is a time for us to rethink what inclusive sustainable development means. It's a time for us to step up anti-poverty efforts. It's a time for us to give great salience to social protection, and give great salience to specific, substantive, actionable, policy relevant, and implementation-centric actions as the central thread of our public policy. This is not the time to go to the blackboard and to rethink theory. This is a time for action. And in the same spirit, I just want to give you a little bit of a sense from what we are doing here in Pakistan about inclusive sustainable development and welfare and poverty eradication. So our efforts, so the efforts of the present government predate the COVID-19 crisis. Back in early 2019, when I joined the government, I was asked to put together a big poverty eradication program. So we thought up of a name. Asas means compassion in our local language. We fast-tracked a process of consultations, and over a 2.5-month period, came up with a wide-ranging poverty alleviation plan. When we started, the plan had 115 elements. Today, the plan has 268 elements. Some of these elements relate to the governance building blocks. Some of these elements relate to the programmatic threads. Some of these elements relate to execution. The others relate to accountability, and yet others relate to how to reach out to communities. So the 268 actions that we now have as part of the Asas strategy are cross-cutting. There are different ways of classifying the 268 actions. If you classify them by the programmatic, by the programmatic pillars, some of them, they fall under 4 headings: human capital development, jobs and livelihoods, social protection, and pro-poor governance. You can also classify these 268 actions based on who they target. Some of them are for orphan care, some are for the care of widows, some of them are for very poor women, some of them are for poor families, others are for livelihood creation, yet others are for livelihood creation in the rural areas, some are for livelihood creation in the urban areas, some are for poor deserving students that from grade 1 to 5, others are for poor deserving students at the undergraduate level, for the secondary level. There are several strands related to promoting financial access to healthcare and promoting universal health coverage. So under the umbrella of Asas, which is the Social Protection and Poverty Alleviation Program, there is this huge, wide aspiration to move the entire system towards welfare. And as I said, different ways of classifying the 268 actions. You can classify them technically, you can classify them based on who they target, as I just mentioned, and you can also classify them based on whose responsibility it is. So we embedded welfare into the work plan of every ministry. For example, and I'll just give you an example, in the Ministry of Overseas Pakistanis, there are about 10 strands out of these 268 that relate to the Ministry of Overseas Pakistanis. Increasing the number of community welfare attaches, making sure that our workers who go abroad have insurance, making sure that our workers who go abroad are briefed well, making sure that their rights are well protected, and so on and so forth. So there are 34 federal ministries into the scope of which these welfare promoting actions were embedded, because it is not just the Ministry of Poverty Alleviation, it is not just the Ministry of social protection, which is what I have responsibility for. And it is not just the Ministry of Health and Education and the National Women Commission, who are traditionally thought of as being the custodians of welfare, but it is, and not just the labor ministry, but it is embedding welfare into the mandate of every department of the government. And this is a very different way of approaching inclusive sustainable development. It's a multi-sectoral way of embedding welfare work into the mandate of ministries and taking it out of the silo of labor, social protection, health and education. It's embedding it into the work of every ministry. It was a difficult program to conceptualize. It was a difficult program in terms of getting the buy-in of other ministries. But now it is a very well recognized program. We all work in government and we think governments are one entities, but governments are actually comprised of different ministries and departments who often have a disincentive to collaborate. So getting a multi-sectoral program embedded was a difficult task, but now it is done and it's running very well. And I think it is because the Prime Minister himself led the execution of this, and the ownership of this program came from the Prime Minister. When I was very active in the multilateral world, we used to talk a lot about multi-sectoral action, about the whole of government approach, about the multifaceted aspect of welfare, and the need for sectors to collaborate. And at that time, because I was outside of the government, I didn't understand how it would piece together. I did not quite understand how complex it was, but now that I have done it with my own hands, I realize the complexity, but I also realize the dividends of the multi-sectoral approach to inclusive development. So just to tell you a little bit about the goals and aspirations of this program and where we are in terms of implementation. Our goal is to reach out to accrue social protection to 10 million families. The other goal, so there's 7 big goals: social protection to 10 million families, universal health coverage for 10 million poorest health families, job and livelihood opportunities for 3.8 million families, access to education for 5 million, and a wide-ranging agenda for making the government pro-poor, and financial and digital access for 7 million women. So these are the big, broad goals of the program. That under the goals are, of course, the different programs that help to achieve the targets. And to execute this massive program, we had to develop a new ministry. We had to come up with the biggest budget line of the government of Pakistan, of data analytics, of a digital payment system, of demand side digital seeking. We had to make a governance of an and we had to make this extensive infrastructure over a year's time to execute this program. And in addition to the infrastructure, we had to make a delivery unit, and the different programs had to be conceptualized, rolled out, piloted, evaluated, and upscaled. So all in all, these last 2 years have been extremely busy, but these last 2 years have also been extremely satisfying because, and for somebody like myself who's worked for the entire period of my life as a civil society and in the multilateral system, for me to see how powerful governments can be. If you can get your strategy right, if you have the right intentions, the right capacity, and if you have support from the top, there is no limit to what a government can achieve. And of course, over the last 2 years, we were very realizing rolling out this massive engine. Another important part of what we did last year was the response to COVID, because when COVID struck, our preparation was at such a level that we were able to give cash, speedy cash, very speedily, currently in a very apolitical manner to 15 million households. And that's a massive amount of people to this period of time. That is because we had developed the infrastructure to do that. And now that we are, hopefully Pakistan will, we're hoping we will not have another wave of COVID. We've already had two. We've gone back to life as usual. And we are now trying our level best. I beg your pardon, it's my phone. I beg your pardon, this is real life. So now that COVID is behind us, we are updating our national census in this fifth most populous country of the world. We have a recent nationwide primary education, a financial access program for children with regard to primary. Very soon launching out of children with regard to secondary education. Pleased to know that the stipend was much higher than the stipend for boys. We've rolled out a brand new health and nutrition conditional cash transfer program, and across all programs of SRs, there is a 50% plus rule that women and girls get 50% of all the benefits. It is a time of great momentum as we scale up our programs. But I just want to finish on the note that even while we were busy giving cash to 15 million families during the height of the COVID crisis, we did not take the foot off the pedal with regard to the other programs that were in the pipeline for us and the deep-rooted reform that was underway. Of course, there are a lot of learning. I continue to look at other countries for the lessons that they have, because, and of course, the Nordic countries, we consider you as the bastion of welfare. You have so much to offer in terms of experience sharing. So I hope that offline we will have a conversation on how to learnings as well. But thank you very much for giving me the floor to present some of the insights back here from Pakistan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nishtar, and your valuable information on the situation in Pakistan, how you have managed to do great progress there. Thereafter, I would like to turn the floor to Mr. Kesamang, and I would like to hear your views from the African Union Commission on this topic. How can we use economy of well-being like approaches under the theme of this CSocD? Please, Mr. Kesamang.
Okay, thank you so much, and let me also greet those who are watching and listening across the globe. As you have heard, I'm representing the African Union Commission, which is the Secretariat of the African Union, which is representing around, which is composed of 55 countries in Africa. And it is important to note that even though we don't use the phrase or the approach of economy of well-being, or adopted it in our day-to-day work, it is talking to a lot of things that we are doing. And it is important also to note that the African Union, in addressing some of the issues after coming from ages of apartheid and colonialism, the Union now is focusing on issues of development. And you may be aware that, of course, coming from the trajectory of economic development, hoping that the trickle-down effect will change the lives of everyone, the African Union has adopted a blueprint of dealing with what development and the well-being of everyone is called the African Union Agenda 2063. And in that, it has got a goal, an aspiration, which says that a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. And the goal comes out clear. It says a higher standard of living, quality of life, and well-being for all citizens. Now you can see that it is saying it is very, very important when you deal with economic development that it is not just about economic development, it's about the people that have to benefit from that economic development. The whole issue of just building a road, building a high-rising building and say, hey, we have got the highest building in the world or in Africa or in Southern Africa or East Africa where I am, which is 100 floors. The question is, how is it affecting vulnerable groups? How is it affecting the woman, the girl, the man, the old man, a person with disability in a rural area? So these are some of the things that we are looking at. And building from this AU Agenda 2063, the department that I'm representing here has come up with what we call the AU Social Agenda 2063. It is trying to say economic development without the clear supporting a strategy on social development will never turn around the poverty, the disease, the need that we see across Africa and across the world. So it is very, very important to come up with a clear social development strategy in order to supplement the economic development strategy that we have. Because I mean, what would be the use of having a speed train coming from Cairo to Cape Town, while actually it is not even affecting or impacting on the people that it runs, I mean, it comes across, like in the rural areas of Africa. Now, in a nutshell, the economy of well-being, the way the African Union is looking at is that everyone should be included. That is why now policies that I will talk about later in other questions, that now policies and legal instruments or treaties that are developed, they have a human face in them, or they should have a human face in them. And they should be developed in partnership with the very same people who are going to be impacted, whether negatively or positively, by any policy or any legal instrument or treaty that has to be developed. So it is very, very important for us when we see, when we look at 2020 strategy, 2030 strategies, we have to have this, that whether you talk of health, you talk of peace and security, you are talking about a human being. You build a road, you build a dam, you build a house, you build whatever, it's about a human being. And by human being, I mean everyone, that whatever you do, include vulnerable groups, include persons with disability, include older persons, include girls, include women. Don't think about them later and think that whatever you have done will trickle down to them, because the moment you start your planning, you start your policy, you start everything, you exclude them, they are excluded forever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kesamang, for your views. And now I will turn to Amanda Janu. You are representing an NGO kind of organization here. How do you see this interaction between economy of well-being and the theme of the CSocD this year?
Yes, well, I really love a lot of the points that the other panelists made as well. And so I think I'll just sort of build on that and acknowledge that I think the idea of an economy of well-being, or the well-being economy, and inclusive and sustainable development really emerged out of similar realizations, that our view of evaluating progress purely in terms of economic growth or GDP per capita was really misleading, right? And actually quite damaging a lot of the times, because for too long we held this idea of a development narrative as this one-way street. And what drives you is economic growth, but without a really clear idea of where we were trying to go. And so ultimately what we're seeing now is many OECD countries realizing that they've built systems that are very good at generating wealth, but their people aren't getting happier, and many times are actually getting less happy, and that they're consuming and developing systems that are destroying our environment and our chance for survival, and the cultural and collective systems that are really needed for resilience and collective well-being. And so what we see now are countries like Finland and Scotland and New Zealand, for example, really taking a step back, and as Sonia said, you know, really considering what matters in life, what really matters for our well-being, and questioning how we can expand our notion of value and our idea of what progress really is, so that it reflects the kind of society we want to be and the kind of society we want to build. And to fundamentally consider how we can build these economies so that they don't just generate wealth, but they actively promote human flourishing and social justice and environmental regeneration. So what I think is really profound, actually, having worked both in the international development space and also now with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, is that the Wellbeing Economy movement really calls into question a lot of our fundamental assumptions about what defines development. Because if true development is achieving collective well-being that can last for generations to come, then I'll say that for at least my country, the US, we're far from developed. And so what's exciting to me is that I think there's a humility in this economy of well-being movement that recognizes the failures of the kind of developed economic model. And what we hope to do, and what I hope all of you can help us to do as well, is to sort of redefine our vision of progress and make development a two-way street so that we can call upon the wisdom and experience and knowledge from the quote unquote developed world and developing world to learn how to build economies that really heal our people and planet and foster collective justice and well-being. So for me, I'm just really excited to hear other panelists and also the participants' sort of thoughts on this intersection as well.
Thank you very much, Amanda, Janu, for your views. And as was already mentioned, we are now living very peculiar times and very hard times all over the world because of the coronavirus crisis, which is touching us all. And that all, of course, highlights the three elements of sustainability: environmental, economical, and social development and sustainability. And I think that you already highlighted, but I would like to hear a bit more. How could we better achieve higher levels of well-being for all while taking into account the planetary boundaries, which are of course, the final question we have to touch upon. I would like to start this round of speakers from you, Mr. Kesamang. What are your views from the African perspective, please?
Yeah, the African Union and as led by the Secretary of the African Union Commission recognizes the importance of technology, innovation, the role of science in ensuring that whatever we do, as we look at development, as we look at economic development, sustainability, we are led by empirical data that we must be having and produced here in the continent by experts in an area. Let me just take agriculture to realize that, of course, I mean, the spaces that are left, which are not occupied by people, uninhabited, it's not that they are increasing. So agriculture is also being squeezed. The marshy areas are also being affected, and the wetlands are being affected, etc. So we look at it from the importance of STR, the science, technology, and innovation. That whatever we do, let us exploit the knowledge that is out there that we also have to produce. And we have already recognized that the importance of technology. And of course, that is the positive thing I may say within the context of the discussion that we got from COVID-19. Suddenly we have realized that, hey, we can live actually using technology, and technology is picking up. Of course, accessibility is very, very important. I mean, from indigenous groups, looking at indigenous groups, looking at other people who are isolated and excluded and not included in this. So it is very, very important to do that we have to, whatever we do has to be sustainable, and it has to be used in such a way that it can also not destroy the climate, or climate change. It cannot cause the whole side effects of climate change, but it can also be sustainable and be able to sustain the people that the development is geared towards. And lastly, also to say that the consumption and consumption has to be also be has also to be looked at, and the patterns have to be, and the consumption and production patterns have to be looked at in order to sustain whatever we have and ensure that everyone and those that have been excluded or that are still excluded, they are part of this. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And meanwhile, I have to recognize that we have a very active discussion also in the chat page. So please use that. Unfortunately, we perhaps can't answer all the questions there. If time allows us, we will go through some questions there as well. But somehow we can also try to answer these questions later on after this webinar. So next, I would like to give the floor to Amanda Chanu. What is your views? Your organization is working very actively also with the climate change issues as well, as I understand. Please.
Yes, absolutely. So in working with governments, at least, and societies that are trying to build economies of well-being, the first step is normally really being clearer on what constitutes well-being. What are the factors that really matter for our well-being? And not only right now, but importantly, thinking into the future as well. So I think this is really where we start to need to really consider the environmental impacts, because if we're not just considering our current well-being, but our future well-being, then we recognize that the intersections between our society, the economy, and the environment are so linked that they need to be explored together. And so for me, I think there's something really important here, that beyond the sort of technical or conceptual or management sort of approach to this process, there is also a very fundamental cultural and value-based aspect to this process as well. So one of my favorite things was in working with the New Zealand government and thinking about how they developed their first well-being budget. They had, first of all, a fairly common view of the environment as a limit, right? And we talk about this a lot, the environmental limits and the planetary boundaries as the discourse we use. But they actually then spoke with their Maori population and asked them to put forward a vision of what well-being meant for them. And their model, what it looked like, was at the center was the spirit, and this is our values. And around that is the earth. And the earth is first and foremost the source of all of our life and society and well-being, and then principles which are really around empowerment for how we can live in a full flourishing sort of life, right? And so this sort of shift around the role of the environment, is it a constraint for us, or is it really the source for us of our well-being, is something that's hard as an American, honestly, sometimes to fully understand, but is really, really embedded and embodied in other cultures and societies, and we see that. And so for me, I think I'm really interested in gaining a better understanding of how we can imbue this system with different values, because ultimately what we know is that contentment and generosity are the two most important values for personal well-being, especially in times of crisis. But we have an economic system that does not encourage us to be generous and definitely doesn't encourage us to be content, right? And so these questions around how much is enough, and how can we share what we have, and how can we know when we have enough, is really vital in order to live in harmony, I think, with our natural environment, and to build collective structures that are really vibrant and strong. And so for me, I'm quite excited, as I sort of said, to envision that these alternative blueprints are unlikely to come from just a technocratic marginal shifts in thinking, right? Like, this is about fundamentally rethinking the values that underpin this system and learning from cultures and communities that have that understanding of enough, and a real deep respect for the environment and its source for all life.
Thank you, Amanda Chanu. And now, Dr. Nistar, you already gave us a very good overview what you have done in Pakistan on welfare. Have you confronted this question on ecological limits and planetary boundaries in your discussions. And also, I would like to ask you a question from the chat page. There is a question from Mr. Bruce Wilson, who asks that could you comment the issue related to developing infrastructure in regard to considering how each particular social groups can access and interact with the infrastructure? Would you like to also to comment that question, please?
So, Mr. Rose Wilson's question of welfare benefits take advantage of the infrastructure and how they can relate to the infrastructure. So I think that's a very fundamentally important question and a very important point that he's raised, because a lot of times we develop out and we think that people are benefiting from them, and we think that people understand things end to end, and oftentimes that is not the case. Oftentimes you have to be very proactive in trying to assess how people perceive that experience and whether they have the capacity to take benefit from that. I'll just give you an example. The infrastructure that we built for our COVID-19 cash assistance to the 15 million households in Pakistan involved an end-to-end digital infrastructure. And I'm going to use that example to give a response to Mr. Rose Wilson. So that infrastructure comprised of three elements. The first element was an SMS, and people could SMS their unique national identity card numbers. So we widely communicated and asked people to SMS their 13-digit national identity card number if they needed help. Once the SMS arrived, then we use data analytics to filter the deserving from the non-deserving. So that's the second part of the infrastructure. And the third part, through which people were paid biometrically. So they would go to bank ATMs, they would go to retail agents where they would put their thumb impressions. They were biometric. The biometrics were authenticated in real time, and they were able to draw the money. But we had to be very proactive in communicating the different elements of this program to people. I recall the first day when we rolled out this assistance, and I went out in the field to ask laborers who had lost their livelihoods. Some of them told me they didn't know how to SMS. They only received phone calls on their phones, on their feature phones. They don't know how to SMS, text message. So then we had to mobilize volunteers. We also found out that a lot of very cheap feature phones don't have credit on their phones. They don't use a postpaid system. So then we had to make sure that the service was made free for them. We had to develop a lot of mechanisms for those who suffered biometric failure when they were receiving the money. So the point I'm trying to make is that creating the infrastructure is one thing for execution, but making sure that people understand how to interact with that infrastructure and how to take advantage of that and how to use it is an entirely different matter. And in order to be very good at that, you have to have your eyes and ears in the field. You have to see how people experience it. You have to take the learnings, you have to plow back the learnings into your design, and you have to have very agile designs to be able to respond constantly to the needs from the grounds. And I'm so glad he asked that question, because without making sure that two-way street is there, your programs would be there, the infrastructure you've created would be all in place, but people will not be able to take benefit from it. Over back to you.
Thank you very much, Sonia Nistar, for answering this question. We will go on. We have now heard good views on how can we go on from the current situation and the problems we are heading all over the world. And I'm listening that approaches like economy of well-being is kind of a tool which we can use to go on. But we need also people and organizations to perform these tools. And I would like to hear your views that what would be the ways and means for establishing better interaction across sectors and agencies, for example, between the social and finance ministries, but also having a view on civil society and NGOs. And that would I like first ask from Amanda Chanu, what's your view? How can we go on? Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think this theme came up a couple times in the other panelists' responses as well. So I think what we're seeing is a shift in not only thinking about different policies, but a different way of developing policies, right? And I think there's a lot of different factors that have led to the fairly siloed approach to governance that we used to use in the past. But in terms of, as you can tell, I'm interested in how this relates to some of our economic narratives and how the economy of well-being ultimately shifts those. And as a general narrative, we tended to previously think about the government's role being primarily the most important role to sort of foster and enable economic growth. And then to take some of the money generated from that growth through taxes and use it to fix the damages that might have been done to people and planet in the process, right? Use it for social protection or environmental regeneration, distribution. But once you move from the singular focus on growth and you expand to much more multidimensional notions of development or progress, this sort of implicit hierarchy of the economy above everything else gets lost, because you see that, as my colleague Catherine says a lot of the time, the question becomes, how can we get the economy to do more of the heavy lifting, right? Like, how can we make sure that we are fostering activities and ways in which we can produce and provide for one another that do heal people and promote long, healthy lives? How can we promote economic activities that proactively regenerate our environment? How can we ensure that we are fostering structures and systems that ensure a fair distribution of wealth and meaningful work opportunities for people, and support trust and connections amongst communities? And so once you dive into these questions, you realize that no individual agency alone can answer them, right? Like, it's going to require a lot of different stakeholders and perspectives to come together to answer that. And so that seems pretty abstract, but so I'll just say, different countries are taking very different approaches on how to better ensure institutional alignment and better policy coherence within this space, with some, requiring that any sort of budgetary proposal or policy has to be brought by multiple ministries to the Ministry of Finance or Treasury, for example, right? Other ones create commissions that represent a broad variety of stakeholders and ministries in a country. But for me personally, I think what's really important is promoting more participatory policy processes, really empowering those who have been historically marginalized to have a voice over their livelihoods and over the economic decisions that impact their lives. So organizing public consultations, citizen assemblies, and really having that feed into the economic policy choices for a country is huge, because normal people don't see these distinctions and these silos, right? Like, everything is just our lives and our experiences. And so in order to transform our governance in line with the new visions we have for the future, I think that participatory processes are really at the core.
Thank you, Amanda Chanu. And from the civil society, we will go to the government. And Dr. Nishtar, you are a member of a government, and I think that's a question is quite kind of an everyday question for you, how you manage to cooperate with your colleagues and how we can use economy of well-being type approaches in putting policies in work.
So the economy of well-being, I mean, I'll give you the example of my country because, I mean, there is a fundamental decision at the government level, at the highest level, that whatever we do should benefit the poorer segments of the society. Now, I just slightly want to digress from this to dwell upon the word well-being. Now, the word well-being is a word of many interpretations. I recall for several years, I was a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on health and well-being. And endlessly, we discussed what well-being means and how it intersects with happiness and what the remit of welfare is. And because well-being is not a concept that applies to very poor people, to disadvantaged people. Welfare cross-cuts our lives. There's an aspect of well-being that's relevant to you and me. And there's an aspect of well-being that cross-cuts at the very high socioeconomic tiers. But the interpretation of well-being I take in the current context is an interpretation that cross-cuts with social protection, with care for the poor, with care for the disadvantaged, with equality promoting public policy. And if that is the interpretation of well-being, then giving you an example from my own country in terms of trying to respond to your question, I think the number one thing is that the commitment has to come from the top. So the commitment has to come from the head of government that well-being is a core agenda, that welfare is a core agenda, and that and then the other thing is that it has to be embedded at every level of the government, in every department of the government. My experience in SARS has taught me that yes, there is an aspect of welfare and well-being and equality promoting public policy that is the domain of ministries of labor and ministries of social protection and health and education, but that there is an opportunity to embed welfare and well-being into the agenda of every ministry, of every department. But in order to do the very top, Amanda just talked about the New Zealand experience of a welfare budget. And that's an example of a very high level commitment to welfare, and then using the budget as a tool of public policy to cascade it down to every level of the government, to every segment of the government, to every tier of the government. And I presume that a government such as the government of New Zealand would have used conditionalities to, and the budget is the perfect tool for that. Our government has a different approach. It's welfare, equality promotion, social protection is an overarching umbrella goal. So no matter which table you're at, no matter which public policy you're discussing, the ultimate decision comes back to the same. Well, what is it doing for the poor people of the country? But the point I want to make is that because this is so multi-sectoral, you need a commitment right at the very top. Because in the cabinet, you are peers. You're competing for budgets, and you have your own turf, you have your own ministries, you have your own budgets, and there's an inherent and you cannot, as one cabinet member, you cannot be forced by your peer to to drive what is the other person's the other cabinet members' core responsibility. So such overarching policies have to come from the top of the government. I think that is what will really drive the transformation. That has been the case in our setting.
Thank you, Sani and Ishtar. Very valuable views. And let's go, Kesamang. What's your perspective from the African Union?
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much. And thank you, my colleagues in the panel. From the African Union perspective is that we are taking a trajectory where we are saying the development should be inclusive of everyone. Because I mean, we used to have these experts called planners and, you know, economists and all that. They would just maybe sit and come up with good things. Of course, they are good as far as they are concerned, but are they addressing everyone? Are they addressing the people that they need to be? The people who are supposed to be benefiting from those? Were they part of the plan? That is why even when we draft a policy as directed by our principals, and we get it, by the time it gets to ministers, the first question they would ask, even just from the experts meeting they were looking at, they would ask one question: how did you develop it? Did we involve the stakeholders, especially if it is about people with disability, especially people with disability? If you don't really cannot give a data or really confirm that, you know, you had the validation with these people, you send it to them and all that, the possibility of them just sending you back to go and do it is so high. I mean, in modern time of Africa, like currently, I'm developing an implementation strategy on combating on combating the harm that is done to persons with albinism, and I'm working with them because it is now a requirement. And next week, Thursday, we'll be meeting for the fourth time before we even take it to the meeting of ministers and experts from the 55 member states. And from there, that's how they own it. They know it is ours. They know that they are now the government. They are part of the government. They can be identified as government because, you know, there is this elusive thing called government. And we look at this thing called government. After 5 years, we will also expect from this government. Now, when people are involved, when CSOs are involved, when marginalized and vulnerable groups are involved, when the private sector is involved, when multi-stakeholders are involved, whether they are local, regional, or international, you can see that the uptake becomes much easier because people identify with what you are doing. They know it is meant for our welfare. It is ours and they own it. So this is how we are looking at it. But lastly, just to say that if you exclude the very same people who are going to benefit from any strategy, you would find that the uptake will be slow and they will look at it as it is someone's thing. It's not ours. But when they have been involved from the beginning to the end, they own it, they identify with it, and they will be able even to support the government or their governments to ensure that it is implemented than when it is not. I can just give an example. When we were developing the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, on the rights of persons with disabilities in Africa, the people with disability were at the forefront of ensuring that it is developed according to the way they would want it. And their representative groups, as I speak today, as an example, just to give you an example, that when you look at a human being, when you look at a person first, when your development is a development of people, whether it's economic or whatever, but to realize that whatever economy it is, just talking about the social development, whatever you do, you find that now they are the ones who are now at the forefront supporting their government to ensure that there is a ratification, there is signing for it to come into force. But if you look at how we used to do it, and we used to do some of our policies and strategies and interventions, where they will just be see it, but they don't even know how it was developed. They would just stay aloof and say, this is not ours. We are not part of this. And it is not going to even change my life because I reject it. But as soon as they just look at it being part of it, and other stakeholders and role players are part of from inception to adoption, you'll find that it becomes easier. But of course, it's not as easy as as I speak. But what is important is that they will even be able to hold their government or their decision makers. They will hold them accountable because they know the ins and the outs of whatever they would be expecting from whatever has been adopted and implemented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lefoko Kesamang. And now I know that Sanja Nistar has to leave us due to other commitments, but just finally to thank you. And would you like to have a say as a message to CSocD, how can we go on these questions? What could the international cooperation give us? Could you say a few words on this yet?
Well, first of all, I must thank you for taking the lead in this very important conversation. Finland has always played such a proactive role in any international discourse on welfare, and I've observed that throughout the years in my career in global health. So I want to thank you. I think this is a very important inflection point in history. Most countries are still grappling with COVID. I mean, the pandemic is by no means over. There's a second and a third and a fourth wave, and nobody knows what's around the corner until we get vaccination to a certain stage. But the impact on the economies has been so dire. I mean, in my own country, there are 15 million individuals who either work in the informal economy or are daily wage workers or are self-employed. And the impact on their lives has been, I mean, there's unspeakable impact on their lives. And we consistently observe this across the world. We're luckily one of the few countries that have made a V-shaped recovery, but there's so many even developed countries where the disadvantaged segments of the population have had unspeakable suffering. So I think that this is a time for us to really rethink the future of welfare. This is a time for us to really rethink the future of social protection. This is a time for governments to really step up the support that they give to the disadvantaged people. This is a time for a very fundamental rethink of how we approach welfare and well-being. And it is within the means of governments to do that. We have in terms of resources, in terms of digital capabilities to deliver. And I think that the responsibility of governments such as yours, who've always been at the forefront of welfare promotion and who themselves have demonstrated it domestically, is immense. So we really look forward to you for leadership. And I think from the vantage point of my country, we will have offline discussions with you on how to team up to generate a global discourse on that. And perhaps raise this very forcefully at the General Assembly this September. We are having very initial thinking about what normative framework to push. So as far as I'm concerned, I look at this discussion as very catalytic. And I will look forward to having offline discussions with you on how to promote this agenda in a big way. And my apologies for signing out a little bit earlier. I'm in another city and I'm called back to the capital. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you very much, Sanja, for your participation. And now we will have a very short technical pause. Don't leave us. We will be online after 1 minute, but just a short break. So welcome back to this webinar on economy of well-being and how can we use it as a holistic approach to achieve the Agenda 2030 goals. And we are in the final round of discussion with our two panelists, Lefoko Kesamang and Amanda Chazou. And I would like now finally hear your views that what is your message to this commission meeting, CSocD, and otherwise, how international cooperation can promote this approach, economy of well-being, to redefine the goals, policies, and measuring tools of inclusive development. And I start with Lefoko Kesamang. What's your view?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, from maybe from the African Union Commission point of view, really to look at this, I think it is important also that this commission should look at when they deal with Africa. I would just like to suggest that this is one area that we need to look at, especially that we have got some strategies that are trying to address such, this kind of an approach, even though, of course, initially I said that we do not have it the way it has been packaged by member countries of Europe. But it is very, very important that we need to look at. I know that when people think about Africa, they just look at issues of peace and security and conflict and all that. But it is very, very important to also to bear in mind that unless the economy of well-being in this context is dealt with, we will still be having conflict and you'll still be pouring money in areas of conflict until maybe wherever you get your monies, it will deplete or get depleted. I'm just saying this from a social development point of view, that our interaction should look at that it is not about the image that we have. That image comes from the fact that the issue of well-being is still lacking and is still lacking behind. And until we deal with that the cake is shared by everyone, not that the cake is shared somewhere and then you come in, you are given just the leftovers of the cake, that you are part of that and you are part of the development and everyone is part of that. For instance, I can speak on the areas that I'm covering on aging and disabilities. And for instance, when they also older people still, I mean, they are the ones who are the creators of wealth. And even after retirement or whatever, as you know that Africa, most of its wealth comes from agriculture. And it is women, just to give an example, and older women who are in agriculture, for your own information. It is older men who are in agriculture. It is people with disabilities, so they should be seen as part of the solution of our economic status or experience. So it is very, very important that whenever you come, whoever comes in this, they should realize that to support Africa as for instance, or any developing region, let us realize that until and unless we come to this balance, we'll still be having the situation that we are having, regardless of how much money you pour into this continent. I'm saying this because I know that when we look at this, mostly we find that programs that deals with the issue of economy of well-being, as it is in this context, they get less support because of for obvious reasons. Let me just end by saying for obvious reasons. Of course, you find that Finland might be having some investments here. They have to be protected. And how are they protected? They have to be protected to ensure that there's peace and security. And then you will be pouring money into peace and security and you think that is how we solve African problems. But I can speak from a social development perspective that for us to have stability and all that, everyone should be included and everyone should have access to development, the benefits of development. Everyone should be seated around the table of or to enjoy that national cake without being discriminated, ostracized, or forgotten. That's what I want to end up with. That is where we need maybe to also look at when we think of partnership with Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kesamang, of your valuable views, and thank you very much for participating in our panel discussions. And then Amanda Jasu, what should we do at the international level?
Sure. I think this question around international cooperation is so critical, actually, because we still keep dealing with the economy like they're held within nation states, yeah, or within communities. But we have built a global economic system now, and we are fundamentally interconnected. And I think what's really important to acknowledge is that because we had this sort of like one size fits all idea of what the economy is, we promoted very particular kinds of mechanisms of globalization that limited our collective imagination and legitimized more and more concentrations of wealth and power into the hands of a very select few individuals and corporations, right? And so as we look right now at really shifting our vision, our notion of progress, our idea of what we are really trying to achieve as a world and as a society, I think it's really important to recognize that in order to build a well-being economy anywhere, we need to do work on building space for well-being economies everywhere, because the fundamental building block is self-determination and empowerment. So we provide space for communities to really innovate and experiment and find new economic systems that align with their values and objectives. And in order to do this, we need to recognize that for decades, we've been promoting very particular kinds of investment, trade, patent, structural adjustment sort of policies that have ultimately led to a situation where we're extracting wealth from the poorest and funneling it now into offshore bank accounts, right? And no government is now able to really access that money, and that's just being kept somewhere. And this is only one aspect of this overall challenge that we face of rebalancing power, of making space for this self-determination for countries, for communities, and that can only happen through globally coordinated action. So, really thinking about Lefoco and the point you said around the pie, right? Like, I was reading an article the other day by a Norwegian economic think tank that for every $1 that flows into Africa, $3 flows out. Yeah, like we have built a really unfair system, but no individual African country feels they have the space or the right to demand that corporations are held to a certain standard, that they protect the environment, that they do more processing within their boundaries, that they keep more of this wealth within their countries. But as a whole, Africa and the African Union, right, and with the EU and with the international community, together they could, create those kind of binding codes of conduct and competition legislation globally, and ban offshore bank accounts and reform patents so you can actually really transfer technologies, right? Not just send them and have to buy them. And so all of these things, I think, require global coordination in order to recognize that the structures we've built will mean that we need different values, not only for seeing the importance of our well-being within our boundaries, but the importance of well-being globally, and to build a really truly just and fair economic system for everyone.
Thank you very much, Amanda Janu, for your fine words, and it's a good words to finalize this discussion today. Thank you very much being with us today. Thank you for all listeners and followers through the internet. I would like to thank you for the active conversation and excellent insights. This panel has provided us new perspectives and examples on how a holistic and integrated approach can help us to achieve more equal and equitable outcomes for social and economic development. This discussion, I would like to bring to your attention that a recording of the event will be available on United Nations TV later on, so everything can be heard and watch once again. As the late United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Kofi Annan said, this is an era of partnerships. Thank you for partnering us today. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye. Thank you.